When I look back on everything, I realize how naive I was to think I could get away with it. But at the time, it all felt so intoxicating, so dangerously exhilarating. My name is Anna, and this is the story of how I betrayed my best friend, Karen, and the twisted aftermath that followed. Karen and I had been inseparable since college. We were the kind of friends who finished each other's sentences, shared our deepest secrets, and supported each other through thick and thin. She was there for me when my first marriage fell apart, and I was her maid of honor when she married Mark. Little did I know that Mark would be the catalyst for the darkest chapter of my life. It all started innocently enough. Mark and I were always friendly. After all, he was my best friend's husband. We'd share jokes at parties, and sometimes, we'd get caught up in deep conversations when Karen was busy with other guests. I never thought much of it. But things changed one fateful night at a charity gala. Karen was out of town on a work trip, and I was there to represent her. Mark looked dashing in his tuxedo, and after a few glasses of champagne, we found ourselves alone. On the balcony. The moonlight cast a silver glow over us, and we talked about everything: our dreams, our regrets, and our unspoken desires. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were kissing passionately, heedless of the consequences. That night ignited a fire in both of us. We began meeting secretly, our stolen moments filled with a mix of guilt and pleasure. I knew it was wrong, betraying Karen like that, but I convinced myself that what she didn't know wouldn't hurt her. Mark and I were careful, or so I thought. Our clandestine meetings were meticulously planned, always in obscure places where we wouldn't be recognized. Why life became a whirlwind of lies. I'd tell Karen I was working late or meeting an old friend, while Mark would say he had business meetings. Every time we were together, I felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach, but I couldn't stop. I was addicted to the danger, the thrill of the forbidden point. One evening, as I lay in bed after another rendezvous with Mark, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I knew Karen better than anyone, and she had been acting strange lately, quieter, more introspective. I dismissed it as my own paranoia, but the nagging doubt lingered. It wasn't until a few weeks later that my worst fears were confirmed. Karen invited me over for coffee, and I couldn't shake the sense of impending doom as I walked into her house. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. "Anna, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat down opposite her. "What's wrong, Karen?" She looked at me with a mixture of hurt and anger that made my blood run cold. "I know about you and Mark," she said flatly. The room spun, and I felt like the floor had been yanked out from under me. "Karen, I don't," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "Just don't. How could you, Anna? How could you betray me like this?" I had no words. Tears streamed down her face, and I reached out to her, but she recoiled. "I trusted you more than anyone, and you've been lying to me for months." My mind raced, trying to find a way to make her understand, to explain the unexplainable. But there was nothing I could say that would make this right. I had shattered her trust, and there was no way to piece it back together. "I never meant to hurt you, Karen," I whispered, my own tears falling. She looked at me, a steely resolve hardening her features. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Anna. But I do know one thing: you'll pay for this. You'll pay dearly." Her words haunted me as I left her house, the weight of my actions crashing down on me. I had no idea what she meant by making me pay, but I would soon find out that Karen was not a woman to be underestimated. In the days following Karen's revelation, I was a mess of nerves and regret. My affair with Mark had blown up spectacularly in my face, and the fallout was even worse than I had imagined. Karen's icy demeanor and cold stares cut deeper than any words could. She wasn't just angry, she was devastated, and I had no one to blame but myself. Mark, for his part, was panicked. He called me constantly, worried about what Karen might do. "We need to be careful, Anna. She could ruin us both," he said during one of our hurried phone conversations. But there was no us anymore. Whatever fantasy I had entertained about Mark and me being together evaporated in the harsh light of reality. We were co-conspirators in a betrayal that had torn apart a friendship. I couldn't even look at him without feeling a wave of shame. Karen, meanwhile, was plotting something. I could sense it. She was too calm, too controlled. Her threats of making me pay echoed in my mind, but I had no idea what she had in store for me. The suspense was excruciating. One afternoon, I received a message from Karen, asking me to meet her at our favorite cafe. My heart pounded as I walked to the cafe, each step feeling like a march toward my doom. When I arrived, Karen was already there, sitting at a corner table, her expression unreadable. "Sit down," she said curtly as I approached. I slid into the chair opposite her, my hands trembling. "Karen, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to make this right." She studied me for a moment, her eyes cold and calculating. "You can't make it right, Anna. But you can start by being honest with me. Why did you do it?" The question hung in the air, and I struggled to find the words. "I don't know. It just happened. I wasn't thinking. I got caught up in the moment, and before I knew it, I was in too deep." Karen's gaze never wavered. "That's not good enough. You betrayed me, Anna. You, of all people, knew what I went through with my first marriage. How could you do this to me?" I swallowed hard, the weight of her disappointment pressing down on me. "I'm so sorry. If I could take it back, I would. I never wanted to hurt you." She leaned back in her chair, her expression hardening. "You're going to regret this, Anna. I promise you that." With that, she stood up and walked out, leaving me to stew in my guilt and fear. I had no idea what she was planning, but I knew it wouldn't be good. The next few weeks were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Every time my phone rang, my heart leaped into my throat, expecting the worst. Then, one day, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Karen. My hands shook as I opened it, dread pooling in my stomach. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a list of demands. She wanted me to cut off all contact with Mark, to confess our affair to my husband, and to leave town for good. The last demand hit me the hardest. Leave town? My whole life was here, my job, my friends, everything. But I knew I had no choice. Karen wasn't bluffing. She had the power to destroy me, and I couldn't let that happen. I called Mark and told him about Karen's demands. "We have to end this," I said, my voice shaking. "She's serious, Mark. She'll ruin us if we don't do what she says." Mark was silent for a moment. "I understand, Anna. We'll end it. But be careful. Karen's not just angry, she's out for blood." As I packed my bags and prepared to leave town, I couldn't help but feel a sense of despair. I had lost everything, my best friend, my lover, and my home. And for what? A few stolen moments of passion? The price was too high, and I was paying it dearly. But little did I know, Karen's plan was far from over. She had more in store for me, and the worst was yet to come. Leaving town felt like a slow death. The city that had once been my sanctuary, filled with memories of laughter, love, and friendship, now felt like a prison I was desperate to escape. But even as I drove away, a sense of foreboding hung over me, as if I were driving straight into the jaws of a trap that had been meticulously laid out by Karen. I settled in a small town a few hours away, a place where no one knew me and where I could try to piece my life back together. It was a quaint, quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business. I rented a modest apartment and found a job at a local bookstore, trying to disappear into the mundane rhythm of small-town life. But despite the outward calm, my thoughts were anything but peaceful. I replayed the events over and over in my mind, trying to understand how I had let everything spiral so far out of control. The guilt gnawed at me constantly, like a dark cloud that I couldn't escape. I tried to push it down, bury it deep, but it always resurfaced, especially at night when the loneliness crept in. Karen's silence during those first few weeks in the new town was the worst part. I expected her to make her next move, to follow through on her threats, but nothing happened. It was like waiting for the other shoe to drop, and the anticipation was unbearable. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, expecting it to be her. But it never was. She had gone completely silent, and that silence was suffocating. One evening, as I was walking home from work, I received a call from an unknown number. My heart pounded in my chest as I answered, half expecting to hear Karen's voice on the other end. But instead, it was a man's voice, calm and professional. "Is this Anna?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, my voice trembling. "This is Detective Rogers from the City Police Department. I'm calling about Karen." My blood ran cold. Karen, what's happened? Is she okay? There was a brief pause before he spoke again, his tone somber. I'm afraid there's been an accident. Karen was involved in a car crash last night. She didn't make it. The world around me seemed to blur as his words sank in. Karen, my best friend, the woman I had betrayed, was gone. Just like that. It didn't seem real. My knees buckled, and I had to lean against a nearby wall to steady myself. An accident? I whispered, barely able to process the information. How did it happen? We're still investigating, but it appears she lost control of her vehicle on a sharp curve. It was late, and there were no witnesses. I'm sorry for your loss. The detective's words echoed in my mind as I numbly thanked him and hung up. Karen was dead. The woman I had feared, the woman who had been plotting my downfall, was gone. But instead of relief, I felt a crushing weight of sorrow and guilt. She had been my best friend, and now she was gone forever, and I was partly to blame that I barely made it back to my apartment, my legs feeling like they could give out at any moment. Once inside, I collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down my face. The pain was unbearable. I had betrayed Karen, and now I would never have the chance to make things right. She was gone, and there was no undoing what I had done. As I lay there, sobbing uncontrollably, a dark thought crept into my mind. What if it wasn't an accident? What if Karen's death was somehow connected to her revenge? The idea seemed absurd at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. Karen had been smart, cunning even. She had said she would make me pay, and now she was dead under mysterious circumstances. It felt too coincidental, too perfect. The next morning, I called the detective back, desperate for answers. Detective Rogers, do you think there's any chance Karen's accident wasn't an accident? He sighed on the other end of the line. It's natural to have questions in situations like this, but from what we've seen, there's no indication of foul play. The road was wet, and she was driving fast. It seems like a tragic accident, nothing more. But his reassurances did little to calm my nerves. Something about this didn't feel right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's death was somehow connected to our tangled web of lies and betrayal. The guilt and the fear began to consume me, and I felt myself slipping further into a dark, paranoid state. In the days that followed, I couldn't focus on anything else. I became obsessed with finding out more about the accident, scouring news reports and talking to anyone who might have information. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find any evidence to support my suspicions. All signs pointed to a tragic accident, but my gut told me there was more to the story. And then, one day, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, just my name written in Karen's familiar handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it, dread pooling in my stomach. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal, the kind Karen used to keep when we were in college. My breath caught in my throat as I opened the first page and saw her neat, elegant handwriting. The entries were dated from just before the affair began, and as I read through them, my heart sank. The journal detailed Karen's thoughts, her suspicions, and ultimately, her discovery of the affair. It was a chilling account of her descent into anger and betrayal, but what struck me the most was the final entry, dated just a day before her death. In it, Karen wrote about how she had forgiven me, how she didn't want to carry the weight of hatred any longer. The words were calm, almost serene, as if she had found peace. And yet, something about the entry didn't sit right with me. It felt too final, too calculated. As I turned the last page, a small note fell out, and my blood ran cold as I read it. You think you're free, but the real punishment has only just begun. Live with that. I dropped the note, my hands trembling. Karen's death wasn't an accident. It was the final stroke in a plan she had set in motion, a plan to make me suffer for the rest of my life. She had forgiven me, but not in the way I had hoped. Instead, she had orchestrated her own death, leaving me to live with the unbearable guilt, knowing that I had driven her to it. And just like that, I realized that I would never escape Karen's revenge. She was gone, but her memory, her voice, her final act of retribution would haunt me forever. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. Karen had crafted her revenge with such precision, such cold calculation, that even in death, she had the last word. I couldn't escape her wrath. It was like she had reached from beyond the grave to ensure that my torment would never end. The guilt that had been gnawing at me was now a full-blown monster, consuming every waking thought, every moment of peace. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Karen's face, her smile, her laughter, her eyes filled with betrayal. And then, her face as I imagined it in her final moments, steering her car into oblivion, knowing that I was the one who had driven her to it. The journal lay open on the table beside my bed, a silent testament to her suffering, her anger, and her twisted forgiveness. I began to spiral. I couldn't eat, couldn't think clearly. My work at the bookstore suffered, and my co-workers began to notice the dark circles under my eyes, the way my hands trembled when I tried to ring up a customer. They asked if I was okay, if something was wrong, but what could I say? That I was being haunted by the ghost of my best friend, a ghost I had created with my own betrayal. It wasn't long before the paranoia set in. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the trees outside my window felt like Karen's presence, lingering, watching, waiting. I knew it was irrational, but the fear was real, and it consumed me. I started seeing her in the strangest places, out of the corner of my eye, in reflections in windows, in the faces of strangers passing by on the street. My mind was playing tricks on me, blurring the lines between reality and the dark thoughts that haunted my every step. The note she had left me was the worst of it. I read it over and over again, the words burning into my mind. The real punishment has only just begun. What had she meant by that? What more could she do to me from beyond the grave? The thought terrified me, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop obsessing over every possible meaning, every hidden message in her final words. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront my demons head-on, to go back to the city, to her house, and try to find some semblance of closure. Maybe if I went back to where it all started, I could put the pieces together, understand what had driven Karen to such lengths. Maybe I could finally find some peace. I drove back to the city under the cover of darkness, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The familiar streets, once filled with memories of happier times, now felt alien, foreboding. I pulled up to Karen's house, the house she had shared with Mark, the house where I had betrayed her. It was eerily quiet as I stepped out of the car, the night air heavy with the weight of my sins. The house loomed before me, dark and silent, a tomb of broken trust and shattered friendships. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, before walking up to the front door. It was unlocked, as if Karen had been expecting me. The interior was just as I remembered it, though now it felt like a museum of our failed friendship. Photos of happier times adorned the walls, pictures of Karen and me at college, at her wedding, laughing, smiling, unaware of the storm that was brewing. The sight of them made my stomach turn, and I forced myself to keep moving. I wandered through the house, searching for something, anything that could explain Karen's final act. Her presence was palpable, as if she were still there, watching me, judging me. I found myself drawn to her study, the place where she had always gone to write, to think, to plan. The room was meticulously organized, just as Karen had always kept it. Her desk was covered in papers, notebooks, and a laptop. I hesitated for a moment before sitting down in her chair, my hands trembling as I opened the laptop. It was password protected, of course, but Karen had always been predictable with her passwords. After a few tries, I was in. What I found chilled me to the bone. There were emails, messages, and drafts of letters that Karen had never sent. They were addressed to me, to Mark, to herself. She had documented everything, her suspicions, her heartbreak, her plans for revenge. Reading through them felt like being dragged through broken glass, every word cutting deeper into the raw wound that had been festering since our affair began. And then I found it. A folder marked Final Plan. Inside were detailed notes about her decision to end her life, but not before making sure I would never escape the guilt of what I had done. She had researched everything, how to make her death look like an accident, how to leave behind just enough evidence to make me question it, to make me live with the doubt, the fear, the crushing guilt. I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was closing in on me as the full weight of what I had done crashed down on me. Karen had been so methodical, so precise. She had turned her pain into a weapon, and I was the target. I fled the house, unable to bear the weight of her final act. As I drove away, The realization hit me like a tidal wave. I would never escape Karen's revenge. She had made sure of that. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, she would always be there, in the shadows of my mind, a constant reminder of the price I had paid for my betrayal. And as I drove back to my lonely apartment in the small town, I knew that Karen had won. She had taken everything from me, my peace, my sanity, my hope. I would live the rest of my days haunted by the ghost of my best friend, a ghost that I had created with my own hands. The days following my visit to Karen's house blurred into one long, torturous haze. I couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't hold a conversation without my thoughts drifting back to the journal, the emails, and the folder titled Final Plan. The images of her carefully laid out revenge replayed in my mind like a twisted film reel, haunting me every second. At night, I barely slept. When I did manage to close my eyes, I was haunted by nightmares, visions of Karen standing at the edge of that fatal curve, staring back at me with an eerie smile before she let go of the wheel. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, only to find myself alone in the dark, the silence deafening. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I made a decision. I needed to know more, to understand the full extent of what Karen had done, and why she had gone to such lengths. Maybe then I could find some semblance of peace, or at least a way to live with the crushing weight of guilt. I called Detective Rogers again, under the pretense of needing closure. "Detective, I can't stop thinking about Karen's death," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "I need to know more about what happened. Please, anything you can tell me might help." There was a long pause on the other end before he spoke. "Anna, I understand that you're grieving, but we've already been through this. Karen's death was a tragic accident. There's nothing more to it. But what about her state of mind?" I pressed. "Did she leave any notes, anything that might explain why she was driving so recklessly that night?" He hesitated, and I could sense his reluctance. "There was nothing out of the ordinary, Anna. We found no suicide note, no signs that she intended to harm herself. She had a lot to live for, a stable job, friends, a bright future. The official report is that it was an accident, plain and simple." His words felt like a cold slap to the face. I had hoped for some confirmation, something to validate the suspicions that had been gnawing at me, but instead, I was left with the same uncertainty, the same questions that had been tormenting me since the night I learned of Karen's death. "Thank you, Detective," I mumbled, barely able to get the words out. I hung up the phone and slumped onto the couch, feeling more lost than ever. As the days dragged on, I started to notice subtle changes in my behavior, changes that frightened me. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at the slightest sound. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like I was being watched, like Karen's ghost was following me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I withdrew from everyone around me. I avoided my coworkers, stopped answering calls from the few friends I had left, and rarely left my apartment unless it was absolutely necessary. I was trapped in my own mind, a prisoner of my guilt and fear. One evening, after another sleepless night, I decided to go through Karen's journal again, hoping to find something I had missed, something that might offer a glimmer of hope. I sat down on the floor of my living room, the journal open in front of me, and started reading from the beginning. The entries were filled with Karen's thoughts, her emotions, her pain. She wrote about the days leading up to her discovery of the affair, how she had noticed the subtle changes in Mark's behavior, the late nights at work, the way he seemed distant even when they were together. She described how she had started to suspect something was wrong, how she had confronted him, and how he had denied everything at first. But as I read on, I noticed something strange, something that hadn't stood out to me before. Karen's writing seemed to change in the weeks leading up to her death. It became more erratic, more frantic, as if she was struggling to hold on to her sanity. She wrote about feeling like she was being watched, like someone was following her, just out of sight. She described hearing voices, whispers in the night, voices that told her she was being betrayed, that everyone around her was lying to her. The more I read, the more I realized that Karen had been descending into a dark place, a place where she no longer trusted anyone, not even herself. She had become consumed by her suspicions, her paranoia, and her need for revenge. And in the end, it had driven her to the point of no return. But there was something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. In one of her final entries, Karen wrote about a dream she had, a dream where she was driving down a dark road, the same road where she would eventually meet her end. She described how the road seemed to stretch on forever, how she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, and how, in the dream, she knew she was heading towards something terrible, something she couldn't escape. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. It was as if Karen had foreseen her own death, as if she had known all along that she would never survive her quest for revenge. But what scared me the most was the realization that her paranoia, her fear, had been contagious. It had infected me, taken root in my mind, and now I was the one who couldn't escape it. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt a deep sense of dread settle over me. Karen's death might have been an accident, but her legacy was something far more sinister. She had left behind a trail of fear and doubt, a legacy that had consumed her, and now it was consuming me. My life continued to unravel, each day becoming a blur of anxiety and fear. The walls of my small apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The air was thick with the stench of stale coffee and my own despair. I hadn't slept properly in days, the bags under my eyes darkening as my paranoia deepened. I couldn't escape the feeling that Karen was still with me, her presence lingering like a shadow I couldn't shake. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw her eyes staring back at me, accusing, condemning. My mind was a chaotic mess, torn between the reality I was living and the nightmare that Karen's death had become. I started to lose track of time. Days bled into nights, and I found myself wandering through my apartment like a ghost, unable to focus on anything for more than a few minutes. The journal lay open on the coffee table, taunting me with its secrets. I knew I should put it away, lock it up, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It was the only connection I had left to Karen, the only way I could try to understand the madness that had consumed her. One particularly dark night, I decided to revisit the accident site. I needed answers, closure, something that could help me make sense of the torment I was living through. I drove to the curve on the old highway where Karen had met her end, the same curve she had written about in her dream. The road was deserted, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional distant hum of a passing car. I parked my car at the side of the road and walked to the spot where Karen's car had gone off the edge. The guardrail was still bent, a twisted reminder of the tragedy that had occurred. I stood there, staring at the dark abyss below, the same abyss that had swallowed my friend. For a long time, I just stood there, the cold night air biting at my skin. I tried to imagine what Karen had felt in those final moments: fear, regret, anger. Did she know what she was doing? Had she really planned it all, or had she simply lost control, driven mad by the demons she couldn't escape? I looked down at the journal in my hands, flipping through the pages one last time. The final entry stared back at me, Karen's words hauntingly clear: "The real punishment has only just begun." Live with that. A sudden wave of anger surged through me. Anger at Karen, at myself, at the entire situation. I screamed into the night, the sound echoing off the trees, but there was no one to hear me, no one to care. My scream faded into the silence, leaving me alone with my thoughts, my guilt. That's when I saw it, a glint of metal among the rocks at the bottom of the ravine. My heart raced as I carefully made my way down the steep incline, the loose gravel slipping under my feet. I crouched down, my hands trembling as I reached for the object. It was a small, silver keychain, one that I recognized immediately. It was Karen's. I held the keychain in my hand, my mind racing. How had it ended up here, so far from the wreck? Had it fallen out during the crash, or had someone placed it here afterward? The possibilities twisted in my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. But there was something else, something even more disturbing. There was a small piece of paper attached to the keychain, folded and secured under the clasp. With shaking hands, I unfolded the paper. The message was simple, written in Karen's neat handwriting: "You're almost there." A cold shiver ran down my spine. Almost there? Almost where? What did it mean? The words sent a fresh wave of panic through me. The fear that had been building inside now threatening to overwhelm me. It was as if Karen was still pulling the strings, guiding me down a path that only she could see. I scrambled back up the incline, the keychain clutched tightly in my hand. I didn't care about the rocks cutting into my skin or the dirt that smeared my clothes. All I could think about was getting back to my car, away from this place, away from the darkness that seemed to follow me wherever I went. Once inside the car, I locked the doors and sat there, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I felt trapped, cornered by forces I couldn't understand. The keychain and the message felt like a final piece of Karen's twisted puzzle, a puzzle I was terrified to complete but couldn't walk away from. That I drove back home in a daze, the events of the night replaying in my mind over and over. The journal, the keychain, the message, they all pointed to something, but I was too terrified to figure out what. All I knew was that Karen's death had set something in motion, something that was far from over. As I sat in the darkness of my apartment, I realized that Karen's revenge wasn't just about ruining my life. It was about driving me to the edge, just as she had been driven. She wanted me to feel what she had felt, to suffer as she had suffered. And as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, I knew that I was on the brink of something terrible, something I might not survive. Days passed, but the sense of dread only deepened. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Karen's face, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and malevolence. The keychain and its cryptic message weighed heavily on my mind. You're almost there. Almost where? What twisted end had Karen planned for me? The question gnawed at my sanity, eating away at any semblance of normalcy I had left. I began avoiding mirrors. Every time I caught a glimpse of my reflection, it seemed distorted, as if Karen's ghost was staring back at me from behind my own eyes. The isolation I had imposed on myself was suffocating. My apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt like a mausoleum, each room echoing with memories I desperately wanted to forget. One evening, as I sat in the dim light of my living room, the journal in one hand and the keychain in the other, I felt something inside me snap. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in the web Karen had woven. I needed to take control, to understand what Karen meant by almost there. I needed to know what final piece she had left for me to discover. With a shaky resolve, I decided to retrace the steps Karen had taken before her death. Maybe, just maybe, I could find the answers I needed, the answers that would free me from this nightmare. The first place that came to mind was the library. Karen had always been a meticulous planner, and I remembered how she would spend hours at the local library, researching, reading, preparing. The library was a place we had visited together often, during simpler times when our biggest worries were exams and future career plans. The thought of returning there filled me with both nostalgia and dread, but I knew I had no choice. If there were clues to be found, they would be there. I arrived at the library just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The building loomed before me, a bastion of knowledge and, perhaps, hidden secrets. I hesitated at the entrance, the heavy wooden doors feeling more like the gates to some forbidden place than the welcoming entryway I remembered. Inside, the library was quiet, almost eerily so. The faint smell of old books filled the air, mingling with the dust that seemed to coat everything. I made my way to the section where Karen had spent most of her time, psychology and self-help books. The shelves were lined with volumes on human behavior, mental illness, and, most unsettlingly, revenge. As I scanned the titles, something caught my eye, a book with a worn cover, its title barely legible. The Psychology of Vengeance. My heart raced as I pulled the book from the shelf, its pages yellowed with age. It felt heavy in my hands, as if it carried the weight of countless stories of betrayal and retribution. I found a quiet corner of the library and began to leaf through the pages. The book was filled with case studies, stories of people who had been driven to acts of vengeance by betrayals both real and imagined. Some of the stories were eerily similar to what I had done to Karen, while others were far more disturbing, detailing the lengths to which people would go to exact their revenge. But what struck me the most were the notes scribbled in the margins, written in Karen's familiar handwriting. She had underlined passages, highlighted key points, and left annotations that sent chills down my spine. One note, in particular, stood out: revenge is not just about punishment. It's about making sure they never forget what they've done. The words were like a punch to the gut. Karen hadn't just wanted to ruin my life, she had wanted to ensure that I would be haunted by my actions forever. The pieces of her plan were beginning to fall into place, and I realized that I was indeed almost there. But where was there? What final act had Karen set in motion? As I closed the book, a slip of paper fell from between the pages. It was a torn piece of notebook paper, folded into a small square. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, revealing another message from Karen, the truth lies in the past. Remember the day we met? The day we met. That was years ago, back in college. We had been assigned to the same dorm room, two strangers thrust together by fate. But how could that day hold the key to Karen's final plan? My mind raced as I tried to recall every detail of that day, the awkward introductions, the shared laughter, the beginning of a friendship that had once meant everything to me, and then it hit me. The cafe. We had met for coffee that day, at a small cafe near the campus. It had been our first real conversation, the moment we had bonded over shared interests and dreams. That cafe had been our go-to spot throughout college, a place of comfort and familiarity. But why would Karen want me to remember that day? What significance could it hold now, after all these years? There was only one way to find out. I had to go back to that cafe, to the place where it had all begun. Maybe there, I would find the answers I so desperately needed. Maybe there, I could finally put an end to the nightmare Karen had left behind. The drive to the cafe was filled with an unsettling mix of nostalgia and dread. The closer I got, the more I felt the weight of the past pressing down on me. It had been years since I'd last visited this place, and the memories came flooding back, unbidden and unwelcome. The cafe, nestled in a quiet corner near the campus, had changed little over the years. The familiar red awning still hung over the entrance, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted out as I approached the door. But what had once been a place of warmth and comfort now felt ominous, as if the air itself was heavy with the ghosts of what had been. I stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly, and was immediately greeted by the same worn, cozy interior. The same checkered tablecloths adorned the small tables, and the same barista was behind the counter, his hair a little grayer but his smile just as warm. But I was in no mood for pleasantries. My eyes scanned the room, searching for something, anything that could be connected to Karen's message. I made my way to the corner table where we had sat that first day, our laughter filling the space as we shared stories about our lives, our hopes, our fears. The memories felt like shards of glass in my mind, painful reminders of the friendship I had shattered. I sat down, the weight of my guilt pressing harder with every passing second. I pulled out Karen's keychain from my pocket, the small silver charm glinting in the dim light. It felt like a talisman, something that connected me to Karen in a way I could neither understand nor escape. I placed it on the table, next to my trembling hands, and waited. For what? I wasn't sure. Answers. Closure. Forgiveness. It all seemed so distant, so impossible. The barista came over to take my order, his smile faltering when he saw the look on my face. Coffee, black, I muttered, not trusting myself to say more. He nodded and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The minutes dragged on, each one an eternity. I sipped my coffee mechanically, the bitterness matching the taste in my mouth. I began to doubt myself, wondering if I was chasing shadows, if Karen's message was nothing more than another cruel trick designed to torment me. But just as I was about to give up, something caught my eye. There, carved into the wooden tabletop, were the initials KM and AW enclosed in a heart. The sight of it took my breath away. We had carved those initials during our senior year, a drunken night where we had sworn that nothing would ever come between us, that we would always be there for each other, no matter what. It was a promise I had broken in the most unforgivable way. I traced the carved letters with my finger, tears welling up in my eyes. How had we come to this? How had our friendship turned into something so twisted, so filled with pain and betrayal? As I sat there, lost in my thoughts, I noticed something else, another piece of paper, folded neatly and tucked under the salt shaker. My heart skipped a beat as I reached for it, my fingers trembling. I unfolded it carefully, revealing another note from Karen. Look beneath the surface. The truth is hidden. I stared at the note, my mind racing. Look beneath the surface. What did that mean? Was there something hidden here, something I hadn't noticed? I looked around the table, my eyes searching for anything out of place. And then I saw it, a small, almost invisible seam along the edge of the table, as if the wood had been cut and then glued back together. My breath caught in my throat as I ran my fingers along the seam, feeling for a way to open it. With a little pressure, the seam gave way, revealing a hidden compartment beneath the table's surface. Inside was a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn and faded. I pulled it out, my hands shaking, and opened it to the first page. It was Karen's diary. The realization hit me like a freight train. This was the diary she had kept during our time in college, the one she had always guarded so closely. The one she had never let me read, no matter how much I had begged. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned the pages, my eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. The entries started innocently enough, stories about our classes, our nights out, the boys we liked. But as I read on, the tone darkened. Karen had written about her insecurities, her fears, her growing sense of inadequacy. And then, she wrote about me. The entries became more and more focused on our friendship, on how much she relied on me, how much she needed me. But there was also anger, jealousy, and something else, an obsession that I had never noticed before. She wrote about feeling overshadowed by me, about how I always seemed to get everything she wanted. And then, she wrote about the affair. I felt sick as I read her words, the raw pain and betrayal leaping off the pages. She had known about the affair long before I realized, but she had kept it to herself, letting the anger and hurt fester. She wrote about how she had planned her revenge, how she wanted to make me suffer as she had suffered. But what I read next froze me to the core. I know what I have to do, she wrote in one of the final entries. I have to make her pay, but it's not enough just to ruin her life. I need to make sure she never forgets. I need to make sure she lives with this forever. She'll think she's free, but she'll never be free. The accident won't be an accident. It'll be my final gift to her. The room spun around me as I read those words. The accident. The car crash that had killed Karen, she had planned it. It wasn't an accident at all. It was her final act of revenge, a way to ensure that I would live with the guilt of her death for the rest of my life. The diary slipped from my hands, falling to the floor with a soft thud. I sat there, numb, as the realization sank in. Karen had orchestrated everything, even her own death, to destroy me. And she had succeeded. I was trapped in a prison of guilt, and there was no escape. The truth was hidden beneath the surface, just as she had said. And now that I had found it, there was no turning back. Karen's final revenge was complete. I left the cafe in a daze, Karen's diary clutched tightly in my hands. The weight of her words, her pain, and her final act of vengeance bore down on me like an anvil. Each step I took felt heavy, as if I were wading through quicksand, sinking deeper into the truth Karen had buried beneath the surface of our friendship. I knew that reading her diary had shattered something inside me, something irreparable. And yet, I couldn't stop now. I needed to understand every twisted detail, to make sense of the madness she had orchestrated. Back at my apartment, I locked the door behind me, needing the security of 4 walls to hold in the torrent of emotions threatening to overflow. I sat on the couch, staring at the diary as if it were a ticking time bomb. I knew there was more to uncover, more revelations that would tear me apart piece by piece. But I had to read it. I owed it to her, to both of us, to see this through to the end. I opened the diary again, turning the pages until I found where I had left off. The entries grew more erratic, Karen's handwriting becoming jagged and uneven as her mental state deteriorated. She wrote about how she had begun to follow me, watching my every move, documenting every detail of my life. She knew when I went to the grocery store, what I bought, who I spoke to. She even knew about the late-night phone calls I had with Robert, calls that I thought no one knew about. It was chilling to realize how deeply she had invaded my privacy, how little of my life had been mine alone. But what struck me the most was how Karen had come to view me not just as a friend who had betrayed her, but as an object of obsession. She wrote about how she couldn't stop thinking about me, how she hated me but also couldn't bear to be without me. Her emotions were a tangled web of love, hate, jealousy, and dependence. It was as if she had needed me to betray her, to give her a reason to unleash all the darkness she had kept hidden inside. Then, I reached the final entries, written in the days leading up to her death. Karen detailed her plans with cold precision, outlining how she would stage the accident to look like a tragic mistake. She wrote about how she had tampered with the brakes on her car, knowing that I would eventually be blamed for her death. The police would find no evidence of foul play, and everyone would assume that I had driven her to such despair that she took her own life. But the real torment, she knew, would come from my own guilt. I would never be able to forgive myself for what happened to her. She had ensured that I would be haunted by her memory for the rest of my life, and then, on the very last page, she wrote something that chilled me to my core. I will always be with you, Anna. Even in death, I'll be there, watching, waiting. You'll never be rid of me. I slammed the diary shut, my hands shaking violently. The air in the room felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on me. Karen's words echoed in my mind, her presence lingering in every corner of my consciousness. She had made sure that I would never escape her, that even in death, she would have power over me. The realization was like a knife twisting in my gut. I staggered to my feet, the room spinning around me. I needed air, space, something to clear my mind from the suffocating grip of Karen's revenge. I threw open the window, gulping in the cool night air, but it did little to quell the rising panic within me. I could feel her everywhere, in the shadows, in the silence, in the very air I breathed. Karen was haunting me, just as she had promised. I spent the night pacing the apartment, unable to sleep, unable to think clearly. My thoughts were a chaotic jumble of guilt, fear, and anger. I kept hearing her voice in my head, taunting me, reminding me that this was all my fault. I had betrayed her, and now I was paying the price. As the hours passed, I began to realize that there was no way out. Karen had orchestrated everything so perfectly, so meticulously, that I was trapped. I couldn't go to the police, they would never believe me. They would see the diary as the ravings of a disturbed mind, nothing more. And even if they did believe me, what could they do? Karen was dead, and her final act had been to bind me to her memory forever. By the time the sun rose, I knew what I had to do. I had to confront my guilt head-on. I had to take responsibility for what I had done, for the pain I had caused. But I also had to find a way to forgive myself, to let go of the past and move forward. Karen's death had been her final act of revenge, but it didn't have to be the end of my story. I sat down at my desk, the diary in front of me, and began to write. I wrote about our friendship, about the affair, about the betrayal, and about the guilt that had consumed me. I wrote about Karen's pain, her anger, and her descent into madness. And I wrote about her final act, the twisted plan she had devised to ensure that I would never forget her. As I wrote, something inside me began to shift. The act of putting my thoughts on paper, of laying everything bare, was like a purging of the soul. The guilt was still there, the pain still raw, but it was as if a small part of the burden had been lifted. I realized that while Karen had succeeded in her revenge, she hadn't taken everything from me. I still had the power to choose how I would live the rest of my life, and so, I wrote my final words to Karen, words she would never read but that I needed to say. I'm sorry, Karen. I'm sorry for everything. But I can't let you control me anymore. I can't let your death define my life. I have to let go. I have to move on. As I finished writing, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The storm of emotions that had raged inside me for so long began to subside, replaced by a quiet resolve. I knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that I would have to face my demons every day. But I also knew that I had taken the first step toward healing, toward reclaiming my life from the shadow of Karen's revenge. In the days that followed, I found myself in a state of uneasy peace. The raw intensity of the past few weeks had dulled to a persistent ache, a reminder of the wounds I had inflicted and received. But there was also a sense of closure, of finality. I had confronted the truth, laid bare the twisted roots of Karen's vengeance, and in doing so, I had taken the first tentative steps toward reclaiming my life. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent, less vivid. I would wake in the middle of the night, Karen's voice echoing in my mind, only to remind myself that she was gone, that her power over me had been broken. The diary, now hidden away in a drawer, no longer held the same grip over me. It was a relic of the past, a past that I was determined to leave behind. I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment where so much had happened. The walls were steeped in memories, the air thick with the weight of the past. I needed a fresh start, a place where I could begin to rebuild, to find out who I was outside the shadow of Karen and the choices that had led me to this point. I found a small, quiet town a few hours away, a place where no one knew me or my story. The house I rented was modest but comfortable, surrounded by trees and open space, a stark contrast to the suffocating urban environment I had lived in for so long. The move was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but as I unpacked the last of the boxes, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Life in the new town was slow, peaceful. I spent my days getting to know the area, taking long walks in the nearby woods, and trying to piece together the fragments of who I had been before everything fell apart. I avoided making close connections, still too wary, too scarred by the betrayal and the loss. But the solitude was healing in its own way, allowing me the space to think, to reflect, to begin to forgive myself. One afternoon, as I was organizing my new home, I came across a small, unopened envelope tucked into one of the boxes. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the handwriting on the front. It was Karen's. My hands trembled as I tore it open, dreading yet another twist, another message from beyond the grave. But what I found inside wasn't a threat or a curse. It was a photograph, taken years ago during our college days. In it, Karen and I were laughing, arms slung around each other's shoulders, carefree and happy. It was a snapshot of a time before the lies, before the betrayal, before everything went wrong. There was a note attached to the back of the photo, written in Karen's neat, familiar script: "Remember who we were. Remember what we had." I sat down, the photograph held tightly in my hands, tears welling up in my eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to mourn, not just for Karen, but for the friendship we had lost, for the dreams we had shared, for the future that would never be. I mourned for the young women in the photograph, blissfully unaware of the darkness that would one day consume them. But as the tears fell, I also felt something else: acceptance. Acceptance that the past was unchangeable, that what had happened between Karen and me was tragic, but not the sum total of our lives. We had been friends once, real friends, and that mattered. Even in the end, amid all the pain and madness, there had been a connection, a bond that couldn't be entirely erased. I placed the photograph on the mantle, a small reminder of what had been, and what could have been. It wasn't a monument to guilt or regret, but to the memory of a friendship that had been real, even if it had ended in tragedy. As I stood there, gazing at the photo, I realized that I had finally reached the end of Karen's journey. She had led me through darkness, through pain, through the depths of guilt and despair. But in doing so, she had also forced me to confront myself, to face the parts of me that I had tried so hard to hide. And now, it was time to move on. The next morning, I woke early, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the windows. The world outside was quiet, peaceful, full of possibility. I made a cup of coffee, savoring the warmth and the comfort it brought. As I sipped it, I felt a sense of calm, of readiness for whatever lay ahead. I had survived Karen's revenge. I